When discussing global power, we often think of governments, the first estate, multinational corporations, the second estate, media, the third estate, and central banks, the fourth estate. But there is a fifth entity, less noticed, yet possessing trillions of U.S. dollars in economic power and operating outside of democratic scrutiny: the massive non-profit organizations, NPOs, and foundations. This is not just about charity. It is a leverage of power. These organizations are funding, shaping, and implementing global agendas, becoming a fifth government operating in the shadows. The trillion-dollar balance sheet of benevolence. The world's largest charities and private foundations hold assets that exceed the GDP of many nations. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, George Soros's Open Society Foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation. These are just a few prominent examples. The total assets of these foundations, combined with countless other affiliated organizations, form a colossal capital reserve, often completely tax-exempt or enjoying significant tax benefits. Tax privilege. Tax exemption is the core of this power. It allows their assets to grow exponentially without the hindrance of tax burdens, unlike businesses and individuals. The money saved from taxes is essentially a resource diverted from the public budget to their own private agenda. Historically, shaping public policy was the responsibility of elected bodies. However, NPOs have filled the financial gap as government budgets tightened. From giving money to shaping policy, these foundations have moved beyond simply providing humanitarian aid. They do not just build schools. They fund the design of curricula and education laws. They do not just provide vaccines. They fund regulatory research and global health legislation. This shift is crucial. Power has moved from setting rules in congressional halls to funding research and lobbying in closed-door conferences. The twin battlegrounds of NPO power. The power of billion-dollar NPOs lies in their ability to leverage finance for deep influence in three key areas: science, regulation, politics, and media. Battlefield 1. Controlling the narrative through science and standards. This is the first and most effective battlefield for NPOs. Funding research. Large foundations fund billions of U.S. dollars to universities, think tanks, and independent research institutes. This money does not come with a pledge of neutrality. A funded study is more likely to yield conclusions that support the funder's desired policy. Prime examples: funding research on climate change, public health, e.g., pandemics, or agricultural reform. By funding, they ensure that the data and conclusions used to shape legislation will be biased in their favor. Setting standards bodies. Large foundations sometimes fund entire international organizations or standard-setting bodies. The World Health Organization, WHO, is an example, where private foundations, especially the Gates Foundation, become major funders, influencing the global health agenda, sometimes more than member states. Impact. When a global regulation is set, e.g., vaccine standards, energy regulations, it is perceived as independent science and becomes the foundation for national law. But the origin of that regulation is the money of billion-dollar foundations. Battlefield 2. The political lobbying machine. Billion-dollar NPOs are the most powerful lobbying organizations operating under the guise of public interest. The revolving door. Key personnel from NPOs often rotate between positions in government regulatory agencies, e.g., FDA, SEC, and vice versa. This creates an implicit consensus on policy. Example: a former charity foundation executive becomes a senior advisor to the president, bringing with them previously funded experience and agendas. Funding policy advocacy. These foundations do not directly fund candidates to avoid violating laws, but they fund affiliate organizations, grassroots lobbying groups, and policy advocacy organizations. Impact. When a bill is introduced, it has often been written or deeply influenced by research papers funded by those very foundations. They use their money to change the political environment, creating public and policy pressure to achieve their goals. Battlefield 3. Manufacturing public perception. MPOs are major players in shaping public perception. Media funding. Large foundations fund investigative journalism projects, media programs on education, health, or climate. Like scientific research, this funding comes with a gauge on the acceptable scope and perspective. Consequence. By funding media and educational organizations, these foundations can filter out dissenting viewpoints or data that do not fit their agenda, creating a manufactured consensus in public opinion. The core threat: lack of accountability. This is the core point of the fifth government perspective: lack of democratic accountability. Governments are overseen by elections, by Congress, and by the judiciary. Billion-dollar foundations are not. They are only accountable to their own board of directors, who are often appointed by the founder. Using public assets for private interests. By being tax-exempt, they are using money that should have belonged to the public to pursue their own specific objectives, which do not necessarily align with the will of the majority of voters. Conclusion: they have the power of government, issuing standards, shaping laws, but without the oversight of government. That is absolute power unchecked. Systemic risk: undermining sovereignty and markets. The power of billion-dollar NPOs is not just market dominance, but the risk of weakening the foundations of democracy and national sovereignty. Perpetual foundationalism. When one or two ultra-wealthy individuals, e.g. founders, can use tens of billions of US dollars to fund global agendas on climate, health, or education for decades, we are facing foundationalism. Their individual will is perpetuated eternally, transcending presidential and parliamentary terms through organizations protected by charity law. Diversity issue. Policy decisions are shaped by a small, geographically and ideologically concentrated group. This leads to a lack of diversity and perspective, and may overlook the real needs and priorities of the affected communities. Market manipulation through funding. Although the official goal is nonprofit, the assets of these foundations are invested in capital markets. Strategic investment. They can invest in companies operating in the field they are lobbying for, e.g., investing in green energy companies while funding strict climate laws. This not only yields profit, but also provides a lever to change corporate behavior. Defining winners/losers. By injecting capital or funding research into a specific area, these foundations are indirectly determining who succeeds and who fails in the market. Erosion of national sovereignty. In many developing countries, charitable foundations have become a major funding source for basic government functions, e.g., national health budgets. This creates a relationship of dependency. Loss of policy sovereignty. When a country depends on funding from private foundations to maintain its health or education system, that country simultaneously has to accept the conditions and agendas of that foundation. National policy sovereignty is subtly eroded. Investor action. The need for transparency. The forgotten power of trillion-dollar NPOs is a systemic risk we cannot ignore. This is what investors and the public need to do. Awareness and source analysis. When hearing about any new policy, law, or scientific study, the first question must be, who funded this? Do not just look at the title. Track the money. Assess regulatory risk. Understand that markets are being regulated not just by governments, but also by NPOs through lobbying organizations. Anticipate new regulations funded by these foundations and adjust your investment strategy accordingly. Invest in sectors being promoted by large foundations. Demand radical transparency. Lobby for laws that require maximum transparency for the political funding and spending of tax-exempt organizations. Power comes with accountability. Do not let the cloaks of charity conceal the truth about this silent political and economic power. In the global economy, there are no free lunches, and no influence is truly nonprofit. They are the fifth government, and they are writing our laws.